All right, motherfucks. I have to say this, all right? I have to talk a little bit about rankings. I don't mean the AEW rankings per se, but just rankings of wrestlers based on things that have nothing to do with wrestling, right? I understand the logic behind it. There is a certain trope behind it that keeps popping up, motherfuckers. For a long time, the metric, the heuristic, if you will, to determine a wrestler's dominance was his or her size, right? China was better than Ivory because China is bigger and stronger than Ivory, and bigger and stronger people tend to win over smaller people. This is not something that can be overcome easily with things like technique. You know, that's one of the biggest myths ever told, is that technique will overcome strength. Technique will overcome strength when the guy that you're fighting isn't that athletic. You know what I'm saying? Like if you're someone that's a black belt in jiu-jitsu and you fight a guy that's bigger than you, like in a bar fight, bigger and stronger than you know, you will have a slight advantage. It'll be like 52% chance you're gonna win versus like 30% chance you're gonna win. It's not gonna make it 99%, right? It's not gonna do that. The only discipline, in my opinion, that can do that would be Western boxing or like Muay Thai, maybe, right? Striking-based shit. Because at the end of the day, you can try to do a sleeper hold on someone, but if someone is substantially stronger than you, it's not gonna work. Believe you me, motherfucker, it's not gonna work. So there you have it, right? In wrestling, in fake wrestling, professional wrestling, a lot of emphasis is put on these guys who are MMA guys, right? Like they're MMA guys, and then the logic just becomes like, oh, Matt Riddle was in the UFC, therefore Matt Riddle can beat up everyone, right? Believe me, motherfuckers, anyone that's been in a fight, anyone that's competed in combat sports and is honest knows that if you took Matt Riddle and you took Kane in his prime, Kane would tear him apart. You know, these fantasies that these MMA fanboys have, you know, these jiu-jitsu fanboys have, oh, he'll kick Kane in the knee. No, he won't, motherfuckers. It's the same shit people said about CM Punk. Oh, CM Punk trains with Randy Couture. He's gonna kick Kevin Nash in the knee and cripple him once and for all. No, he wouldn't. Here's what would happen in real life. CM Punk would go there, his athleticism is nearly zero. Kevin Nash would just grab him by the throat and strangle him. That would be the end of that. That's how the real world works. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, Hoist Gracie beat up these other guys. Yes, back in the day when people had zero technique at all, right? When it was just like a gassed out fat guy trying to punch Hoist Gracie, and Hoist Gracie's like, oh, I'm not gonna let him punch me, I'm gonna grab him by the throat, then yes, you can beat those guys, right? Hoist Gracie would never be able to beat an athletic boxer like Hoist, considering like Hoist Gracie can beat Tank Abbott, who can last like a round and a half. But if you took Hoist Gracie in his prime and you put him against Roy Jones Jr., there would be no Hoist Gracie the next day. You understand me? Roy Jones would end his career. It would not even be close. Oh, he's gonna do a leg lock. No, he wouldn't. Here's what would happen. He'd go for a takedown, lower left hook to the jaw, dead. That would be the end of that, motherfuckers. And let alone, you know, going to these absurd things like who would win a fight, Bruce Lee or Mike Tyson. It would take 15 Bruce Lees to even try to injure Mike Tyson. Do you understand the kind of machine Mike Tyson was? This is one of the greatest athletes in the history of sports. And you think a stuntman, an actor, can beat him up? It's ridiculous. It is only something that people who have never been in a ring would ever say. Now, I'm not the biggest guy, so don't think I'm like biased against this, right? I understand my personal limits, and I understand the limits of those around me. And of course, smaller guys can beat up bigger guys. It's just not the norm, right? However, in wrestling, there's this idea that because Matt Riddle was in the UFC, that he's somehow like stronger and tougher than someone, let's say like Sheamus, right? I don't believe that's the case, motherfucker. Is he more athletic than Sheamus? Yes. Matt Riddle is actually one of the ones that is actually, you can tell by looking at him, that he has raw athleticism. Like he is an athletic guy. You know, you're just born with that shit, right? But like of course you can beat up like Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods and like Dean Ambrose and these guys who are like, you know, normal guys basically, more or less. Of course you would destroy those guys in 10 seconds. But to suggest, for example, that Matt Riddle versus like Great Khali in his prime, Matt Riddle would kick Khali's leg because that's a weak spot, is fantasy land. It's like those movies with those three ninja kids that beat up adults. You know, it's like believing Home Alone is real. In the real world, have you motherfuckers seen Casino? Joe Pesci would grab fucking Macaulay Culkin and he would kill him in the first 3 minutes if that was the real world, motherfuckers. The real world doesn't follow these fantasy rules. All the small guy beats the little guy. But for some reason in wrestling, this keeps being the trope. I blame MMA, I really do. Because MMA has given this, like MMA has done an incredible job, especially UFC, of promoting its fighters as if they are world-class athletes. The truth of the matter is this, motherfucker. Francis Ngannou, for example, perfect example. Francis Ngannou, they kept talking during his title fight about how he wanted to be a professional boxer, but then he was convinced to become an MMA fighter, right? And I'm like, no, he wasn't convinced. The reality was, Francis Ngannou would never be a world champion in boxing. It is impossible. He is not athletic enough. It's as simple as that. Forrest Griffin, UFC champion, he would never be a champion in anything else. And here's the perfect example. Look at Ben Askren, motherfucker. Look at Ben Askren. Now, before people start like running their mouths, people that don't know anything, Ben Askren is an MMA legend. He's one of the GOATs. He's one of the best welterweights of all time, right? He is a two-time world champion in two different organizations, in two different continents. You understand what I'm saying? And he was undefeated until he got to the UFC. Now he's like in his mid-30s, and he's not like this super athlete anyways, so it's understandable that he might lose. But is it understandable that a combat athlete would lose to a YouTuber? Now, a lot of people are like, oh, Ben Askren is a wrestler. He's a wrestling-based guy, and this was a boxing match. But that doesn't make any sense, because the implications there are that Ben Askren has no idea about striking. Now, Ben Askren was never a renowned striker, but he has been in the ring hundreds of times sparring and dozens of times in competition with people that have tried to strike him in the head. And he was undefeated for a long time. So what does that say about the level of MMA compared to other sports in athleticism? Better put, take someone like LeBron James, right? A mega athlete, a super athlete, right? And have Jake Paul go against LeBron. Obviously in basketball, LeBron win 100-0. But go and have Jake Paul or Logan Paul or anybody else on YouTube go to LeBron and beat him in like, I don't know, a jumping contest, right? That's the equivalent of what happened to Ben Askren. A guy came and beat him in something that is adjacent to his sport, in one of the main skills of his sport, which is boxing, in the context of MMA. It would be like someone like Jake Paul going and beating Cristiano Ronaldo in like a dribbling challenge or in a foot race. There is a 0% chance of that happening. Like someone like Jake Paul, who is an accomplished athlete, I'm not going to take anything away from the kid. He's a good athlete and he's a good boxer, right? But if you put him in the ring with like a real boxer, it's a wrap, it's done. Like a third-rate boxer would destroy him. It won't even be close. But if you take him and you put him with an inferior athlete, then of course he has a chance. You know what I mean? Like if you put him in there with like Cristiano Ronaldo and you say, here, we're gonna play 10 sports, randomly picked sports. Cristiano versus Jake Paul. Cristiano Ronaldo would win in all of them. It wouldn't even be close. LeBron would win in all of them. It wouldn't even be close. But Ben Askren would lose in like 8 out of 10. He would even lose in a sport that he has mad experience in. Oh, he was never a striker. No, motherfuckers, he was a striker. The facts are what the facts are. The UFC has done a really good job of pretending that their athletes really are world-class athletes. There are very few world-class athletes in UFC. Very, very few. It is primarily filled with people that were not good enough to go to the Olympics for wrestling. We're not good enough to become world champions in boxing. We're not good enough to be anything but what they are in the UFC. And this can be evidenced by people like Brock Lesnar with minimal and like near zero combat experience beyond wrestling. He goes in there as a hobby and becomes the heavyweight champion. He beats legends like Randy Couture as a hobby, motherfucks. He tried really hard to go to the NFL. He couldn't make it because the level of athleticism in the NFL is substantially greater. Now, in the future, in the UFC, we're going to see some super athletes. But for now, we have to put up with people like Francis Ngannou and have them be portrayed to us as if they are these super athletes. The facts are what the facts are. Francis Ngannou is a guy who has shitty boxing, he has shitty striking, he has like no wrestling. So I think in a fight between, let's say, him and Tyson Fury would destroy him in 12 seconds. Because it's not like Francis Ngannou is going to pick his leg. And what the fuck do people think? Do people think that like boxers don't know how to move their legs? Like boxers are just there right for the picking? If so, why didn't Stipe Miocic pick the leg of Francis Ngannou, motherfuckers? The facts are what the facts are. This idea that MMA has the best athletes is ridiculous. And this extends into wrestling. And people like Matt Riddle, again, he's an outlier because he is an exceptional athlete. But to suggest seriously that, for example, me and my friends saw the Conor McGregor fight a few years ago. And I'm like, Undertaker would kill Conor McGregor. And they all laughed at me. Now, none of them have ever experienced any kind of fighting in a ring, right? They have no experience. I have some experience fighting in a ring. So I'm thinking to myself, these guys have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. They really bought the lie that someone like Conor McGregor has a chance against the Undertaker in a real fight. I'm talking about prime Undertaker. Undertaker's like 60 years old now. Now, of course, he'd beat him up. But against prime Undertaker, You think Conor McGregor cannot hurt Prime Undertaker, motherfucker? He doesn't have the strength. He can barely hurt Nick Diaz, who's like a jobber who would never be an athlete in any other sport. People like Nick Diaz can have successful, semi-successful careers in the UFC. In no other sport would Nick Diaz be anything but a JV player. In nothing, man. Nothing. He can never be a pro basketball player or a pro soccer player or a pro football player or a pro boxer. Nothing. He can only be a pro in the derivative sport, in the leftover sport, right? So when people tell me like, oh, Bobby Lashley, I mean, Bobby Lashley's a big guy, so of course he's strong, right? People are like, oh, Bobby Lashley would beat Mark Henry. You have no idea how strong Mark Henry is and how much stronger he is than Lashley. You have no idea what Mark Henry's capable of doing or what Big Show's capable of doing. Because to a lot of people, this is just theory, motherfucker. Which brings me to the main point I want to make. Adam Page versus Brian Cage. Adam Page beat Brian Cage on AEW this last Wednesday, motherfuckers. Sorry, Brian Cage won, sorry. Brian Cage won, but he won by attacking Adam Page before the match started. And when he pinned him after hitting the drill claw, all the announcers, including Taz, who was doing commentary as well, kept pretty much saying that this was like a huge win for Brian Cage or that it was a huge upset. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is an extension of the same principle that MMA has done. Whereas like you see someone like Jake Paul coming in to and fighting a world-class athlete in a sport that's closer to what that athlete's been doing his entire life and beating him in a minute, right? And then I still have to pretend that MMA guys are like the toughest athletes. All they do is get their ass kicked by better athletes. They try to move up in different sports to make some money, and it never ends well. Like they never have a chance. Like McGregor was supposed to be this like elite striker. The facts are what the facts are. If Mayweather wanted him out in 1 minute, he could have done it in 1 minute. Just like that, motherfucker. In one combo, Mayweather would have killed Conor McGregor if he wanted to. People are just like, they're so naive. They really don't understand all this shit, right? And this naivete extends to things like pro wrestling, where you see an Adam Page, and because the society has pretty much told you that like little guys, technique is better than strength. It's not better than strength. Believe you me, motherfucks. It's not better than strength. I'd rather be stronger than a guy I'm fighting and have less technical ability than the opposite. Believe me, it's gonna come in much more handy, right? But because of his technique and experience, all this other shit that doesn't really matter at the end of the day, Adam Page losing to Brian Cage is considered an upset. What should happen is after Brian Cage pins him, all the announcers should say, well, what else could we have expected? Like, he's about 3 times the size of Adam Page. They don't even acknowledge this, motherfucker. They don't even acknowledge this. You know what I mean? So there you have it. That's the kind of shit that we have to deal with in wrestling, and more specifically in AEW. Like, you'd think like, he's not even the champion. Like, Adam Page isn't even the champion, you know? He beat a smaller man. He beat the shit out of a smaller man and cheated. And it was still an upset. What the fuck? If Brian Cage, if somehow AEW signed Brock Lesnar, and they had Brock Lesnar versus Brian Cage, and Brian Cage wins, it's still not an upset. No one versus Brian Cage is an upset, because Brian Cage, look at this motherfucker. Compare that, for example, to something like Rey Mysterio, right? Rey Mysterio in the Royal Rumble that he won, the week before, WWE released that little report where they talked about the odds of every superstar winning, right? Rey Mysterio had a 1 in 20 or 1 in 25 odds of winning. The same as people like Viscera, Chavo Guerrero, etc. But we all knew, obviously, Rey Mysterio was one of the favorites to win that Rumble, just because of the storyline behind it, Eddie Guerrero's death, etc., etc. Like, I believe personally that the winner of that Rumble would have been Eddie Guerrero if he was alive. I think that's how it was going to get booked. And it would have been him versus Batista. But then Batista got injured and, you know, they had to call an audible, basically. That's what I think would have happened. So they gave it to Rey Mysterio instead. But the point I'm trying to make is this, motherfucker. Even when Rey Mysterio was ready for a push to the main event of WrestleMania, the kayfabe maintained a certain level of reality. They kept saying Rey Mysterio doesn't have a chance. Rey Mysterio is too small, right? Because he is too small. And it would be a huge upset if Rey Mysterio, let's say like the last 2 people were Rey Mysterio and Viscera. It would be a huge upset if Rey Mysterio eliminates Viscera, even though we all know Viscera has no chance of winning. But you have to pretend that size matters, even if it doesn't, motherfuckers. And in AEW, they do the exact opposite. The same way that UFC keeps trying to push. UFC is awesome. I love UFC, don't get me wrong. But they keep trying to push this narrative that anyone that's ever been in the ring will tell you is horseshit. Now, of course, UFC people won't say that because they believe their own shit, number one. And 2, why would they try to bury themselves, right? Like, all the UFC guys were like, Ben Askren is going to kill Jake Paul. Why do they all think that, huh? Because they really believe that someone with Ben Askren's training should, and they're right, should have an edge over Jake Paul. We're talking about a 2-time world champion, motherfucker. Can't even beat a random kid in boxing. Are you fucking kidding me? If Jake Paul fought LeBron in boxing, LeBron would whoop his ass. If Jake Paul did a jumping contest, like I said, with LeBron, LeBron would whoop his ass. If he ran a race against LeBron, LeBron would whoop his ass. And same thing with any other elite athlete, like Tyson Fury. He might not beat him in like a race, but he'd beat him in basketball. He'd beat him in soccer. He'd beat him in anything where stamina is required, because that's a fundamental of fighting: stamina. It's just how it works, motherfuckers. But Ben Askren would not. He would not be able to beat someone like Jake Paul in most sports, because he couldn't even beat him in a sport that is very close to his own. So there you have it, motherfuckers. Overrated shit that involves weight classes, that involves skill levels, that involves all this garbage that we've just accepted as normal, you know? And this is the logical conclusion. The logical conclusion is, if Brian Cage were to next week beat Darby Allin, it'd be considered the biggest win of his career, and it'd be considered a huge upset. When in reality, it should be like this. Brian Cage should get in the ring with Darby Allin, grab him by the throat, powerbomb him 15 times, hit an F5, hit a drill claw, and pin him with 1 foot. That's what should happen. But that's not what's gonna happen. Because we've learned, motherfuckers, over time, that it doesn't matter what the truth is. You know, the truth doesn't really matter. It matters how you present it. If you present the UFC as having elite world-class athletes, then yes, people will believe that. But if you look at the UFC, you see people gassing out in the 3rd round. In what other sport do people gas out? In what other professional sport does someone say, I can't play anymore, I need to sit down? Only in injuries. In soccer, you go in there and you run around for 90 minutes. And if you can't do it, you're never gonna be a soccer player. In the UFC, you can still do it. You can have the stamina, the gas tank for 5 to 10 minutes, which means you don't train that hard, believe me, or you're just that unathletic, and then you gas out, and you can still have a career. You could be like a guy who doesn't know what the fuck he's doing, like Nate Diaz. You know, he's just a tough guy. He's like one of the early UFC guys. He fights like those guys. Like very little actual skill, you know, but can take a beating and has some grappling abilities. So there you go, motherfuckers. That's what I have to say about this. Peace out and have a good weekend, cuck.